I'm Matt.
And I'm Jonny.
And this is our van. It's a Volkswagen Transporter T5 and we're converting it into the ultimate small camper van.
It's only little, so we're being sure to use every inch to maximise the space we have.
But don't worry, the process we show you in this series will work for any van, no matter the size or shape.
So let's get on with it. Right, so your beloved van is prepped, insulated and ready to move on to the more exciting stuff.
In this video, we're going to be showing you how to install a basic floor, ceiling and the walls so that your home away from home starts to feel like a lovely log cabin and less like a spaceship.
So first up, the floor. Like we mentioned in the last video, the floor is probably the lowest priority in terms of insulation. But the benefit of putting a wooden floor down now is that later on when you're making your furniture, you have something nice and sturdy to screw it all into.
If you do decide to skip this step, it'll just mean that you'll have to screw directly into the metal floor of your van, which could lead to some rust problems if you're not careful.
So if you were lucky enough to have a van that already came with a plywood floor, then easy peasy, you can screw this straight into the battens you've already laid and you're done.
Otherwise, you're going to want to make a template and then cut this out like we're doing in our case.
An easy way to do this, particularly if your van has lots of awkward shapes to template around, is to use cardboard scraps just simply taped or glued together. Simply butt a piece of cardboard up to the edge of where you want the floor to go, stick it to the previous piece and repeat.
When it comes to the non-straight edges, like around the wheel wells, all you've got to do is try and trace that curve onto the cardboard, cut it out and then check it fits okay. You may need to go back and adjust this a few times just to make sure it's a nice snug fit.
This doesn't need to be millimetre perfect as it's all going to get covered up by the storage units later anyway, but get it as close as you can. The nice thing about using cardboard scraps is that if you're not happy with the section you've done, just scrap that piece, use another one and go again.
Seeing as our floor is bigger than a single sheet of plywood, we cut it into two sections. In our case, we just split it where our van vault ends, but you could just do it wherever you see fit.
We use 12mm hardwood ply as the flooring for the van, which we're going to cover up at the end of the build with something a little bit prettier. Once your template's done, you can trace it onto the plywood and cut it with a jigsaw.
We found that a couple of multi-stands really came in helpful here as it kept the plywood supported as we were cutting it.
Once cut, it's time to give it a test fit, and you may need to go back and make some adjustments to get it fitting just how you want.
Once you're happy with it, be sure to mark up where those battens are on the top of your plywood so you know where you can screw into.
Before we installed the floor, we sealed the edges of the plywood with some clear matte lacquer just to keep it protected from moisture. We also used aluminium foil tape to seal all of the battens to help prevent moisture by creating a vapour barrier.
Depending on how you're laying out your electrics, you may also need to drill a hole in the floor to pass your wires through. It's then just a case of screwing your floor in place along those batten lines using wood screws. Just make sure those screws are the right length to go through your plywood and into the battens without hitting that metal floor.
Once you've given it a literal test run, you're ready to move on to the ceiling. We want to make a bit of a statement piece out of the ceiling in the van, so we're planning to use strips of wood to go down the length of the van with a small shadow gap in between each one to give a really nice contrast. We then plan to add some LED strips down some of these gaps to give some nice ambient lighting, but done in a subtle way.
We're going to have a separate video focusing on how to attach these strips of timber and the LEDs, but for this video we're just going to show you how to attach the plywood to the ceiling, which will act as the backing.
Firstly, we found it helpful to mark all of the batten locations onto the foil insulation so you know where you can drill safely. Quick tip, it's really handy to take some photos at this point, as you can look back on these later on once the cladding is up to work out where all your batten locations are. We use 4mm ply for the ceiling, as this has got enough give to bend to the curve of the ceiling while still having enough meat to be able to screw into later on.
We were fortunate enough that a single sheet of plywood covered most of the ceiling. The only place that was left uncovered was down the right hand side of the van, but we're going to be putting some floor to ceiling storage units there later on, so it'll all get covered in time.
If you have a bigger van, it's no problem, just do exactly the same process, just with multiple sheets. Another quick tip for you, we found it super helpful to have one of these cheap extendable poles to act as a third hand and save our little arms getting tired holding that plywood on the ceiling. In fact, it would have been really helpful if we had a few more actually.
We marked out any parts of the roof that kind of stuck out and then cut these out using our jigsaw to make sure it's a nice snug fit. Again, there's absolutely no need to rush, so just take it slowly, and if you need to, just cut slightly undersize, check, and then you can always take off a bit more if you need to. This way you don't accidentally remove too much material and have to come up with some bodged fix to try and sort it out.
We also have a roof vent in our van, so we were careful to cut around this, being sure to measure twice and cut once.
Our technique for marking up the right screwing locations for our ceiling was to screw partly into the battens and then push the plywood ceiling in place. Then, as the plywood was so thin, we could use these little magnets just to find where those screws were and then mark up that point.
We were also sure to put some markings on both the plywood and the insulation so that every time we put the roof back up, it went back in exactly the same place. We then removed the plywood so that we could take those screws out, then we put the plywood back on the ceiling and put the screws in, holding it all in place nicely.
Right, next we're moving on to the walls and we're treating each side a little bit differently. So depending on your van layout, you can pick and choose as you see fit. It's at this point that it's also worth saying that a pair of knee pads or even like a small chair are a very welcome addition to make this whole process a lot more comfortable.
Our right hand wall is going to be used for all of our storage units, so none of this backing is actually going to be visible. So therefore, rather than spending too much time being really careful about cladding this wall, we're using some 9mm softwood ply to give us enough to screw into later on.
Again, we used our trusty cardboard trick here to make the template. We're not worrying about getting these super tight around the wheel wells, as these are going to get boxed in when we're doing the storage units. Don't worry, we'll be showing you all of that in a later video.
After cutting out the shapes, knocking down all the sharp edges with a sanding sponge, we then tested the fit and got them screwed into place. And since this is all going to be hidden, we figured there's no point wasting time trying to make this all out of one awkward shaped board, so we did this in 3 separate sections. This also helps with the curve of the van walls, as the thicker plywood doesn't bend quite as easily as the thinner stuff does.
When cutting straight edges, the track saw works great for this, as we can be sure that those edges will butt together perfectly. It also means that we don't need to keep running back into our workshop and try and manoeuvre a big sheet of plywood around our table saw. We can just do it all on the floor around the back of the van.
Lastly, we moved on to the left-hand wall. As this was going to be the only finished surface that would be visible when the whole van is complete, we wanted to take a little bit more time to make sure this looked the part.
So for this, we're using 8mm interior cladding, which we'll be painting at the end of the build. First, we made these two curved battens which span the wall from top to bottom. We went back and forth trying to transfer the curve of the van onto the wood until we had something we were happy with.
We're using tongue and groove cladding here as it's nice and easy to install and it looks really clean. We attached a vertical strip for the cladding to butt up to, and then we had a load of shims on hand to make sure we could pad out those battens in any places that needed it.
Then it was just a case of trimming each piece to size and screwing it in place. We made this little drilling jig out of an offcut just so that all of our screwing locations would be in the same place and it would all look nice and uniform.
We had to measure and cut out where we wanted to put all of our charging sockets and our switches. This is simple enough to do, just make sure you keep the same measure twice, cut once approach in mind. But if it does go wrong, you only really lose one piece of cladding which you can reuse at another point and replace it with a single piece.
For the final piece, we just traced the curve of the ceiling using a large washer and cut this on a gradient to get a nice fit. If you're not able to do this, you can always get this fitting as best as you can, and you can always trim it with something like rope later on.
And there you go, your van is actually starting to look just a little bit like a camper. At least at this point, if you're really desperate to get out, you can chuck a mattress in the back, go out camping, and you'd just be without some of the extra luxuries.
In the next episode, we're going to be showing you how to make a really cool slide-out bed that acts as a single, a double, and a corner sofa.
So be sure to subscribe to the Triton YouTube channel so you don't miss it.
Have a good one, gang.
See you on the next one.